Good afternoon, my beloved brethren and sisters in the hope of Israel. Yesterday we considered, briefly it has to be said, the events leading up to and surrounding the first great earthquake, which was of course the fall of paganism as the religion, the state religion if you like, of the Roman Empire, and established in itself corrupted form of Christianity, and that since that day, since 312, when the Edict of Toleration was issued, it has been the state religion of most European countries, Turkey probably being the exception to that since 1453. So this afternoon then we are to consider the next second great earthquake, which Brother Matt read in the details of the Apocalypse chapter 11. And the same hour was there a great earthquake, and the 10th part of the city fell. And in the earthquake were slain of men 7,000, and the remnant were affrighted, and gave glory to the God of heaven. Stating the obvious again, we don't take everything that we read in the book of the Apocalypse literally. Alluding to what we said yesterday, for example, the first great earthquake was a political earthquake. The same applies to the earthquake which we're to consider this afternoon. This corrupted form of Christianity did not, in any way, shape or form, alleviate the tyranny that God's servants have felt. Reading in the Apocalypse chapter 12, which was the more detailed account of the first great earthquake, we read, "And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she hath a place prepared of God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days." And why are we told this? Why was this prophesied? Why, if Christianity was now established as the state religion, did the woman have to flee and be nourished in the wilderness, as it's termed? Well, as you've said several times already, the Christianity espoused by Constantine was not the true Christianity. It still retained the symbol of Daniel's fourth beast. Remember that Daniel's four beasts, which represented Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece and Rome. Well, Rome represented the fourth beast. That beast symbol wasn't abolished on the accession of the Christian Constantine to the empire. In fact, the beastly characteristics of that fourth beast were retained, and the persecution of the woman, or the faithful Christians, as the woman came to represent in this consideration, are testimony to the fact that the tyranny was by no means alleviated by the accession of Constantine to the throne. As you said, in AD 324, the Council of Nice was held, which formalized that doctrine of the Trinity that has become entrenched in nearly all Christian believers. So within 12 years, it had already adopted one of the key beliefs of paganism. In this 11th chapter of the Apocalypse, read, "And there was given me a reed like unto a rod, and the angel stood, saying, Rise, and measure the temple of God, and the altar, and them that worship therein. But the court which is without the temple leave out, and measure it not, for it is given unto the Gentiles, and the holy city shall they tread under foot 40 and 2 months. So there's one time period to bear in mind. And I will give power unto my 2 witnesses, and they shall prophesy 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. There's another time period to keep in mind. These are the 2 olive trees and the 2 lampstands standing before the God of the earth. And if any man will hurt them, fire proceedeth out of their mouth, and devoureth their enemies. And if any man will hurt them, he must in this manner be killed. These have power to shut heaven, that it rain not in the days of their prophecy, and have power over waters, to turn them to blood, and to smite the earth with all plagues as often as they will. And when they shall have finished their testimony, the beast that ascendeth out of the bottomless pit shall make war against them, and shall overcome them and kill them, and their bodies shall lie in the street of the great city, which is spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt, where also our Lord was crucified. First thing to remember is that the apostasy was now entrenched in the Roman Catholic, the seat of Rome, and now held jurisdiction over everything within the Roman Empire. So we have 2 time periods here. The holy city being trodden underfoot 40 and 2 months, and the sackcloth witnessing in verse 3, which was for 1,260 days. Now if we apply a day for a year principle and accept that the Jewish month is not made up of a variable between 28 and 31 days as we have in our calendar, but is always 30 days, then 42 months multiplied by 30 comes to 1,260, which on a day for a year principle is 1,260 years, and applying the same rule for verse 3, we end up with another 1,260 years. So they're both the same time period. Why then, we ask the question, are they symbolized differently? Why one 42 months and the other 1,260 days? Well, they really represent different aspects within the prophecy. Aspects which are not unassociated, they're inextricably linked, but they do represent slightly different elements concerning the power of Rome and the witnesses of Jesus. And also, they have different starting and termination dates. Now, what we must say here as well is that these 2 witnesses were not necessarily the true servants of God. Brother Thomas identifies a secular fulfillment of the witnesses and a religious. So within the 2 witnesses you have a secular and religious element of the witnessing. Within those 2 witnesses were the true believers. But we will find that the behavior of the 2 witnesses at large was very much in contrast to the commands of the Lord Jesus. So the 2 witnesses are not to be confused with true believers, although the true believers as a body were included within that class. The Edict of Milan, as we've already said, was proclaimed freedom to Christians. But this was soon violated by Constantine in withdrawing this freedom to a certain group of people who from then on would become known as heretics. If the Roman Catholics say that someone is a heretic, it's probably a good indication that they have a more idea of the truth than what they do. So as soon then as this man-child, Constantine, was brought forth, he began to discriminate and persecute the woman. Chapter 12 verse 14 tells us, "And to the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place where she is nourished for a time and times and half a time from the face of the serpent." That's another 1,260 years. And this is all a continuation of that prophecy in Genesis chapter 3, where there would be conflict between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. Brother Thomas in Eureka says, "For 300 years after her flight, she was fed and nourished in the Roman Africa and the Cottian Alps." So that would take us to up towards 600 AD. At the end of these centuries, she disappeared from the African wing of the great eagle and manifested her presence in Armenia and Asia Minor. And when she could no longer find food and nourishment there, She migrated in the course of 150 years into France, and then into Bulgaria, and up the Danube westward and northward through Hungary and Bavaria. In the 9th century, the witnessing of her seed was no longer heard in Armenia, Asia Minor and Thrace, but was more particularly limited to the Alpine regions of Italy, Switzerland and France. In the 12th century, the witnessing of her seed in these countries became so hateful to the Roman Catholic Church that its malice against her became unbounded. The rivers and fountains of waters, he says, or those who ruled among the mountains and valleys of the Alps, were stirred up by the spiritual head of that communion to shed their blood without mercy. Nevertheless, the food and nourishment afforded her enabled her to endure and to continue her witnessing in these Alpine regions until the expiration of her 1,260 years. End quote. So we get the picture then that the saints, and along with those, the class is made up of the two witnesses, those who protested against the tyranny of this new government, were forced to flee to wherever they could find rest, which is in many ways a fulfillment of the command of Christ, who said, if they persecute you in this city, flee to another. Not queue up as martyrs to be put to death. And this was the flight of the woman. It was a flight in regards to her place, where she found herself, and it was a flight regarding her state. In other words, she would never be able to prosper in such a climate. Always on the back foot, if you like. The first one we look at then is Apocalypse chapter 3 of the sackcloth witnessing. I will give power unto my two witnesses, and they shall prophesy 1,260 days clothed in sackcloth. In around the time of Constantine, there was a group of people who followed a character by the name of Donatus. They became known as Donatists. This group sort of became isolated from the rest of the Christians because of an incident in Africa. Sicilianus was a corrupt bishop. He had actually persecuted his brethren, the Christian. He was a Christian himself and had persecuted his brethren, probably the true believers, and also given his Bible to be burnt when the pagan authorities prior to Constantine were trying to exterminate Christianity. So we have another wonderful character of a Christian in someone who's actually prepared to persecute and is prepared to burn his Bible just to avoid persecution himself. Despite that, he was elected to be the bishop of Africa by the Christian majority, and he was supported by Constantine. Now the Donatists refused to accept such a character as a bishop, and they seceded from this church which had become so corrupt as to appoint such a bishop. In turn, they refused to accept any into their fellowship from that state church without prior examination and re-immersion. It's difficult to know whether the Donatists had the truth. Chances are they didn't, but certainly they held a much higher standard than the state church did. This, Brother Thomas identifies as the commencement of this 1,260-year witnessing in sackcloth, and puts the date as AD 312 to 315. If we add 1,260 to that, we will come to AD 1572 to 1575. So the characteristics then we need to look at to identify this period of witnessing is that it was firstly no longer a preaching work like the work of the apostles. It was now a period of witnessing. So the job of the witnesses was not to go and convert the Europeans to Christianity. It was basically to witness against the error and against the immorality of the state church. This was the witnessing in sackcloth. We witness today in the same way, but we don't witness in sackcloth because we aren't persecuted. If we were persecuted, we would be witnessing in sackcloth. we would be suffering, which is what sackcloth represents. And that's because the power to persecute has been removed from the governments of the world. It also commenced at a time when there was something tangible to witness against. The earliest it could have been was 312. It couldn't have been before, because as we said, this was the work of the White Horse, which was which had on its back the Arrowless Bowman to convert Europe to Christianity. It also had to end when the witnessing power ended, which states the obvious in many ways. We're given the time period, and so of 1,260 years. So, as we said, AD 312 plus 1,260 brings us to 1572, which is a date many of you, if not all of you, will be familiar with, but we'll return to that a little bit. Now, 42 months. Verse 2. The court, which is without the temple, leave out, and measure it not. For it is given unto the Gentiles. In the holy city shall they tread underfoot 42 months. Now this is unmistakable, and has more than a passing resemblance to the prophecy in Daniel, where Daniel was told that the power of the fourth beast, that little horn power, would prevail against the saints. This is the treading underfoot, 42 months, the holy city. And in verse 1, he was given a reed like unto a rod. Now this rod is, in the Greek, rhabdos, which is a rod of chastisement. So what we have then is a period of trial, a period of chastisement. Paul tells us in Hebrews 12, for whom the Lord loveth he chasteneth, and scourgeth every son whom he receiveth. On the other side, he was told not to measure the court of the Gentiles. This tells us that the court of the Gentiles was not to be given a time frame in this scenario, indicating that the time period of the Gentiles, Gentile ascendancy, would be longer than the period of the witnessing of the two witnesses. So when did the 42 months start then? Are we to look to AD 799 on that famous Christmas when, after Charlemagne had annexed the three horn powers to the Pope, the Kingdom of Rome, the power of the Lombards? Nothing happens overnight. AD 799 was not the start of the papal power of blasphemy. It was the hideous system established in the time of Constantine, but the power grew over the succeeding centuries. Daniel 7 tells us, he shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws, and they shall be given into his hand until a time and times and the dividing of time. So we then have to look for a period, not when the papal power would reach its zenith, but when the saints would be given into the hands of the authorities to be persecuted. For that we will then be able to identify the commencement of the 42 months. If we can find the start, we are also able to verify it by finding if there is a suitable ending, which we believe we are able to do. AD 324 to AD 608 is a period which Brother Thomas identifies as the time when this God of guardian saints, this Bishop of Rome, the Bishop of the Apostasy, was growing in power. In 529, Justinian's Code was issued, which basically said that the Pope was the head of the Bishop of Rome, was the head of the churches. And in AD 533, he declared that the Roman bishop has universal supremacy. 75 years later, that Rotter, the Emperor Phocas, in AD 604, he declared the Pope to be the head of all the churches. In other words, saying that of all the forms of Christianity, the Pope was the head. Now what these two emperors did, Justinian and Phocas, they gave the Pope power to to dictate the laws of Christianity. He became to be all that Daniel and Paul predicted he would be. He would be that person to speak great words against the Most High and change times and laws. And he was the one who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God. So on the screen you can see AD 529 plus 1260 brings us to 1789. And AD 604 plus 1260 brings us to 1864. Are these two dates verifiable? Do they provide for us a suitable ending of this treading underfoot 40 and 2 months? We believe they do. And in actual fact, the year 1789 was the commencement of this second great earthquake. And what happened just prior to that? Brother Thomas in Eureka says, but in the 16th and 17th centuries, the power of the strong government of Europe was brought to bear upon her seed, the woman's seed, the witnesses. The two wings of the great eagle no longer afforded her protection, so that her witnessing against Catholicism and the Antichrist, whose power had now reached its greatest altitude and breadth, was suppressed in all the kingdoms or homes of the beast of the sea. Now we saw the start of the sackcloth witnessing, which was in AD 312, and we said that that would take us up to 1572. Is this a date that we can verify? Yes, it is. You will be familiar that in 1572, the French issued an edict to effect the massacre of St. Bartholomew's. So on St. Bartholomew's Day in France, something like 30,000 Protestants were massacred in Paris. Throughout the country, it has been estimated that 75,000 Protestants were butchered, with or without the blessing of the Pope. I leave you to answer that one, given the fact that the government of France was regarded as the 10th of the city. In other words, it was one of the homes of the papacy and did nothing without the blessing of the papacy. So from 1572, we find that the two witnesses were now fighting for survival. It wasn't just a contest as it had been prior to that. It wasn't the first time persecution had broken out against them, but now the tide was turning very, very heavily against the two witnesses, and they were struggling for survival. There was an intermission given in 1598 when the ex-Huguenot Henry of Navarre became King of France, and he issued the Edict of Nantes, which secured toleration for the Huguenots. But during the 16th and 17th centuries, we are told that they finished their testimony for two reasons. One, in 1685, under the Louis XIV, influenced heavily by the Jesuits, he revoked the Edict of Nantes. That removed the legal protection that the Huguenots enjoyed. And secondly, we are given to question the faithfulness unto the end of the Huguenots. The Ecclesias were told in the first couple of chapters of the Apocalypse, but that which ye have already, hold fast till I come. It would appear from historical, the scant historical evidences we have, that perhaps the Huguenots weren't holding fast, and therefore finished their testimony. So because of persecution, the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, in 1685, they finished their testimony. And this commenced the 3.5 days death state of the witnesses. During that time, Europe was in complete and utter blackness. Roman Catholicism ruled supreme. This period has been well characterized by Monsieur Claude, who wrote something called a short account. He said, amidst 1,000 hideous lamentations and horrid blasphemies, they hang men and women by the hair of their heads, or by the feet, to the roofs of their chambers, or to the racks in the chimneys, and there smoked them with wisps of wet hay, till they were no longer able to bear it. And when they took them down, if they would not sign, they immediately hung them up again. They plucked off the hair of their heads and beards with pincers, till they left none remaining. They threw them on great fires kindled on purpose, and did not put them out till they were half roasted. They plunged them again and again into wells, from whence they would not take them out till they had promised to renounce their religion. They bound them as they do criminals put to the rack, and in this posture, with a funnel poured wine down their throats, till the fumes of it depriving them of reason, they were made to say they were Catholics. They stripped them naked, and after having offered them 1,000 indignities, they stuck them all over with pins. They lanced them with penknives, and sometimes with red-hot pincers took them by the nose, and so dragged them about the room till they promised to turn Catholics. They bastinadoed them most cruelly, and then dragged them thus bruised to the churches, where this forced appearance was accounted abjuration. They kept them from sleeping 7 or 8 days together. They tormented them in 1,000 ways. They tied them to bedposts, and ravished their wives and daughters before their eyes. They plucked off the nails from the fingers and toes of some, and blew both men and women up with bellows, till they were ready to burst. Do we need any more convincing that the Christianity established in Rome was pseudo-Christianity? That it was apostate? It was about as far away from the truth as the pagans were before them? That such were the infamous dragoonings by which the earth was subdued and silenced by the beast of the abyss? And I should take a moment and think about Hebrews chapter 11, where Paul said, and others had trial of cruel mockings and scourgings, yea, moreover of bonds and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn asunder, were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and in mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. Considering what some of these people had to go through, as we said, sadly, a lot of them probably didn't have the truth. But some of them, we believe, firmly did. And this is what some have had to endure for Christ's sake. I missed out one slide, which I think we've all seen. It very ably, visually demonstrates the beginning and ending of this 42-month period. You have a 75-year starting point from 529 to 604, give or take 4 years on each, and then give or take 4 years at the ending as well. 1789 to 1864 brings us to the end of this downtreading period. It's not the purpose of our study to look at 1864 in any detail this afternoon. Needless to say, that was the time of Victor Emmanuel and Garibaldi, which ended the temporal power of the papacy. But it is our study to look at the years 1789. So as we said then, Louis XIV, who was the one who revoked the Edict of Nantes, was heavily influenced by the Jesuits. In fact, the assassin of Henry IV, who was the one who issued the Edict of Nantes, his assassin was influenced by the Jesuits, and after he assassinated him, confessed to the Jesuit priest. When the priest was tried, he said he had been given divine instruction to forget, or some rubbish like that. Now, this is in many ways a multifaceted divine operation. Yes, the Jesuits are wicked. Louis XIV and all his predecessors and successors were wicked. Even Henry of Navarre, I mean, he was a Huguenot, and he essentially turned Catholic just for the glory of the kingship of France. So we may say that he was wicked as well. All these people were wicked, but are not the wicked God saw? What we find culminating here, which is very, very interesting, is a preparation for this huge, great earthquake that was characterized in 1789. It was a judgment on the Huguenots for finishing their testimony, so that the revocation of the Edict of Nantes was issued. It resulted in the establishment of a tyrannical monarchy in France that would create an ulcerous irritation in the people, which would result in the most horrific revolution yet known. And the influence of the Jesuits would bring economic ruin to France, which, if you look at the history of the Jesuits, is the same wherever they've been. They brought down the economies of Spain, Portugal. Portugal is still languishing as a result of the influence of the Jesuits. God works in wondrous ways. Verse 8 of Apocalypse chapter 11, their dead bodies shall lie in the street of the great city, which spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt, where also our Lord was crucified. And they of the people and kindreds and tongues and nations shall see their dead bodies 3 days and a half, and shall not suffer their dead bodies to be put in graves. And they that dwell upon the earth shall rejoice over them, and make merry, and shall send gifts one to another, because these two prophets tormented them that dwell on the earth. They actually struck coins. The mints of Europe actually struck coins to recognize and commemorate the death of the witnesses, as it's apocalyptically termed. The fact that they were unburied is not an accidental mention in the book. The fact that they were unburied meant that there was the spirit left there. They weren't to be executed and left like that forever. Because the Catholics, they wanted to expunge the memories. I mean, they tried everything they could to erase anything to do with Protestantism from their dominions. But of course, there were countries like Britain, America, and Canada, and the Young Lion countries who did afford them protection. And in this way, they remained unburied. And it was these countries to which the Huguenots fled, taking with them their millions of francs and all their skills, leaving France, one decimated country. But after 3.5 days, the spirit of life entered into them. The revocation of the Edict of Nantes was on October the 18th, 1685. 1789 was exactly 103 years, 4 months, and 12 days afterwards. Now that sounds like an odd number to come to, but I can refer you to Elpis Israel, where Brother Thomas says, explained how we come to those dates given the lunar months, and it is very, very, the way it works out is very accurate. And on February the 18th, 1789, the witnesses rose upon their feet. Verse 11, after 3 days and a half, the Spirit of life from God entered into them, and they stood upon their feet, and great fear fell upon them which saw them. What happened in February the 18th, 1789? We'll answer that in a little moment. (1789) was the year which commenced the French Revolution. It has been called the crossroads of modern history. That's by the historians of the world. The effects of the French Revolution are barely comprehensible to us today, who have known freedom all our lifetimes. But the results are well documented. The banner of liberty, which is the three-striped flag, flies from Rome to Mexico City, from Bucharest to Dublin. So these 3 stripes on all the flags of the world represent this liberty liberty, fraternity and equality, which was characterized by the French Revolution. So the effects of the French Revolution are not very easy for us to see today. But if you compare it to the lack of freedom, the complete lack of freedom prior to that, it will not be so difficult to conceive of. Now, of course, the world only sees the significance of liberty, fraternity and equality. We need to see a little more in it than just that. We need to see in the French Revolution the judgments of God upon the beast power of Rome. Now, why did the French Revolution happen from a natural standpoint? Yes, of course, we know God was working in it. But God doesn't just make something happen. He influences the affairs of man. There were a combination of factors and influences during the time of Louis XVI, prior to the French Revolution. Historian William Doyle says, certainly this was what the revolution began with, just liberty. And on the 26th of August 1789, the National Assembly promulgated a founding manifesto to guide its work, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. This was something entirely new in the history of the world. And we, of course, have seen how this has become rather an ugly thing, whereby men and women see they have rights to this, rights to that. This was not the spirit of the servant of God. But we can see where the radical thinking came from. It was kind of like the spring being compressed. The harder you push the spring down, and then you release it, the higher the spring rebounds. This was essentially what happened in France. After years and centuries of oppression, the people rebounded with horrific effect. Describing the situation prior to 1789, Thomas Carlyle says, "It is spiritual bankruptcy, long tolerated, verging now towards economical bankruptcy, and become intolerable." And this sums up exactly what Thomas Carlyle said there. This sums up exactly the problems leading to the French Revolution. He saw the ancient regime, as it was called, of the French monarchy as rotten and utterly deserving of its fate. Lots of people today would disagree with that. But he was a true Protestant, and he saw the Catholic monarchy as corrupt in church and state, and the church and state were inextricably linked, of course. Essentially, the problem was, looking at it from a human point of view, was financial overstretch. Rather frightening when we consider that the world's economies today are in financial overstretch, and we know where that's going. But Thomas Carlyle admitted that it was spiritual bankruptcy. So essentially, the morals failed, followed by the economy. France had fought 3 great wars during the 18th century. They had established a position of great dominance, but then found it challenged by Russia, Prussia, and above all Britain. They were defeated eventually by the Prussians in the 7 Years' War, and their naval fleets, even before the time of Napoleon, had been destroyed by the Royal Navy. As a result, Britain drove France out of North America and India. And the result of these wars was that the British were enabled to strangle the supplies to the French. So the luxuries from the Caribbean, North America, India, were now difficult for the French to obtain. This was one of the problems which resulted in inflation. Now, wonderfully, they saw opportunity for revenge on the British when the American colonists declared independence in 1776. In 1778, France declared that they were going to war with America against Britain in the hope of destroying the British Empire. They were, of course, successful. Britain was thrown out of America, which became known as the United States. But at what cost? The British apparently spent £80 million in their day, in the late 18th century. They spent £80 million and ended with a national debt of £250 million, which it easily financed and paid off in the next 10 years. The US the new country spent $37 million at the national level, plus $140 million by the states. And this was mostly covered by loans from France and the Netherlands, loans from wealthy Americans, and the issuing of paper money. So the Americans didn't do too badly either. The French, on the other hand, they spent 1.3 billion livres, about 56 million pounds, about $100 million. That's in those days. I don't know what that works out to today, resulting in a horrific national debt. And at the end of the day, Britain still had Britain. The US was a new founded country, but the French had gained nothing. They didn't even succeed in estranging the Americans from the British, whose trade ties continued. The monarchy itself was extravagant and corrupt, using vast amounts of money. Anyone visiting Paris can visit the Palace of Versailles, and it is horrifically large, well decorated. It would have even more works of art in there had the French Revolution not destroyed most of them. But anyone who visits there gets some feeling as to just how lavishly this monarchy lived. And it can't be supported forever. What about the clergy? In many ways, this was the biggest problem. That historian William Doyle said this clergy, a vast corporation drawing revenues from 1/10 of the kingdom's land and creaming off in the form of tithes a national 1/10 of the yield of the rest, paid no direct taxes on the grounds that it performed its service to society by praying and interceding with God. This was the system of Roman Catholicism, and it strangled the economy of France just because of their greed and avarice. The nobility was the other thing. They owned about 1/4 of the land in France, and yet the nobility were something like 1% or 2% of the people in France. And they themselves somehow managed to avoid paying taxes as well. So you had this wealthy clergy, this wealthy nobility who avoided paying taxes. And this doesn't take a genius then to work out that the burden of the French economy fell on the peasants of France. And lastly, we've already mentioned this, the Jesuit influence had ruined the country. The departure of the Huguenots from the country had decimated France of skills and money. And it's estimated they lost 60 million francs just because the Huguenots were forced to leave the country. The historian Bowman says, the depopulation, the reduction of national prosperity were the acute material consequences of their triumph, followed by a spiritual impoverishment which could not be cured, even by the best Jesuit school. This is what France suffered, and the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits that is, had to pay for very dearly later. He was, of course, referring to the French Revolution. And in all things, God is always prepared to help things get worse. A famine struck in 1788 and again in 1789. So the country was, as you can see, ripe for a revolution. Brother Thomas says the day of vengeance for the national crimes of 1572 and 1685 had arrived, and they were divinely appointed executioners of judgment upon the court, aristocracy, and clergy, so that no device contrived against them was thus allowed to prosper. We've all heard that quote, where the people of Paris cried, "We have no bread." And the Queen said, "Give them cakes." It sums up the ignorance or the out-of-touch condition of the monarchy of France. In the same year, the Prussians invaded Holland. The French, because of the economic crisis, was told by the Minister of Finance that they were unable to afford to wage the war. This was the end of the Bourbon dynasty as a military power. France was now crippled militarily. It had no money to fund anything. Soon after, we know that the dynasty was ended altogether. And there's a picture there It's called, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, I'm not, most of the Canadians can probably correct me on this, but I think it's something like the Trois Ordres, which essentially you can see the peasant carrying a bishop and a member of the nobility. That sums up the financial situation in France. The burden of the taxes was on the poor, not on the corrupt clergy and the wealthy nobility. What the Trois Ordres, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, means is the three orders, or the three estates. Now what happened, the minister at the time was a man by the name of Calonne. He was the finance minister, and he attempted to make various reforms to solve all these economic problems. He wanted to increase the taxes, and he made the fatal mistake of wanting to introduce a change to the tax rules for the nobility and the clergy. Well, they were up in arms, and to their stupidity, they elected to call for the Estates General. And what the Estates General was a system whereby all three classes would be represented in the decisions made in government, so that the nobility, the clergy, and the peasantry would get a say. It wasn't quite as simple as that, and the peasantry were misguided, but nevertheless, they called for the Estates General to be convened to try and solve the problems of France, just because they objected to the introduction of taxes, and they thought I don't know what they thought the Estates General could accomplish, but they thought they could. Verse 12, they heard a great voice from heaven saying unto them, come up hither. And what did we say on the 18th of February 1789? The Estates General was called together and elections began for the election of various people into the Estates General, so that various members of the clergy were elected, various members of the nobility, and various members of peasantry. It was convened on the 2nd of May 1789, so this completed, elected Estates General convened on the 2nd of May 1789. Now this convention apparently highlighted the discontent among the lower orders of society, as was to be expected, and also indicated that the Estates General could do nothing to solve the problems. So the nobility and so on and so forth had called for the Estates General and found it can't actually solve the problems of society. And the peasant element of the Estates General called for a radical change in the way that the Estates General was run. They invited some of the poorer clergy to join them, so that the power, if you like it, if you divide the number within this convention by 3, you'd have 2/3 of them made up by nobility and clergy, and then only 1/3 made up by the peasantry. So by maths, you can see that the nobility and the clergy, who had similar interests, would always vote and outvote the peasantry. But a stalemate continued for several days, even weeks, and everybody realized that nothing was happening. It was still peaceful at this time, but soon the peasant element of the Estates General, the third estate as it was called, persuaded some of the nobility, perhaps the more just-thinking nobility, some of the more honest-minded clergy, to join them, which boosted their numbers. Eventually, to the peril of the clergy and the nobility, lots more joined. And what was once an Estates General made up of 3 classes became the National Assembly on the 17th of June the same year. This was the founding act of the French Revolution. And the tennis court oath was held on the 20th of June, whereby this National Assembly gathered and vowed never to separate until the National Assembly had given France a constitution. This was fatal to the monarchy. A constitution spells the end of a monarchy which was dictatorial. The king realized, however, that he was powerless. He dismissed his new finance minister, which was the favourite of the third estate, the peasantry. and this really sparked the beginning of the French Revolution. Incensed, they stormed the Bastille, released all their prisoners, stole all the city guns, resulting in the fact that Paris was now in the hands of the rebels. The Bastille, this mysterious prison, was demolished. It was probably the prison where thousands of God's servants had been held, and it was demolished. Thus began these earth-shaking convulsions. I'm just going to go very quickly through the events of the French Revolution now. On the 4th of August, which was a massively key date, feudalism was abolished. There was no such thing in France now as privileges and venality. Now, for those in the New World who probably don't understand feudalism, it's essentially a system whereby the positions of warriors and land is all locked in to a certain family. It's almost like a caste system, I suppose. But essentially that was abolished. Now there were no rights. Just because you were born to a wealthy landowner didn't mean that you were entitled to that land, or in any position of government for that matter. All these privileges were abolished. The very lifeblood of the system of Roman Catholicism in France was being destroyed. On the 26th of August, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, which you made mention of, was first published, which was the foundation for liberty, fraternity and equality. On the 5th of October, the king, recognising that his head could roll pretty soon, decided to flee. He was caught and dragged back. Events were too slow for the impatient populace. Brother Thomas this is not Brother Thomas, but this is from Eureka. Events were too slow for the impatient populace, for while the court and the aristocracy were intriguing, and the National Assembly discussing, the people were crying for bread. The mob, determined to go to Versailles and call the king and the assembly to account for their hesitation to secure the welfare of the people. From all quarters was heard the cry of "the king to Paris," which the aristocracy proposed to prevent by carrying him off to Metz, where, in a fortress, the court might order what it pleased. All were in commotion. Paris poured forth its thousands and attacked the palace of the king, whose foreign mercenaries would have been massacred but for the interposition of Lafayette. With frightful howlings, the mob demanded the removal of the royal family to Paris. At length, they were gratified, and the procession started. "I hope," says Lavalette, "such a scene will never be witnessed again. It was the conveyance of the royal representatives of Charles IX. His Queen Mother," it wasn't Charles IX, he was alluding to the fact that Charles IX had gone before, and that he saw Louis XVI as the royal representative of Charles IX. His Queen Mother and Louis XVI, the sanguinary murderers of the witnesses of Jesus, prisoners of a mob as ferocious as they, to the place of their future execution. "These madmen," he continues, "dancing in the mire and covered with mud, surrounded the king's coach. The foremost groups carried on long pikes the bloody heads of the life guardsmen butchered in the morning. A group of women, ugly as crime itself, swarming like insects and wearing grenadiers' hairy caps, went to and fro howling barbarous songs. Several of these abandoned women, drunk with wine and fury, rode astride upon the cannon, celebrating by their abominable howlings all the crimes they had committed or witnessed. Others near the king's carriage were singing allegorical airs, and by their gross gestures applying the insulting allusions in them to the queen. In the transports of their brutal joy, the women stopped the passers-by and yelled in their ears, while pointing to the royal carriage. 'Courage, my friends,' they said, 'we shall have plenty of bread now that we've got the baker, the baker's wife and the baker's boy.' This scene lasted for 8 hours before the royal family arrived at the Paris de Grève. They alighted at the Hotel de Ville, their first resting place during protracted misery that terminated afterwards in a horrible death. Thus ended the memorable 6th of October 1789. So you can see then the monarchy is now in the hands of the people. And let's not feel too sorry for the people. These people have probably done their fair share in the persecution of the of the witnesses, or maybe not these people, but their forefathers. They said, "Give us bread." And as one historian said, they soon had corpses. In 1790, on the 13th of February, monastic vows were forbidden. So you can see that this is not just an attack on the monarchy, this is an attack on the clergy. On the 19th of June, the nobility was abolished. On the 27th of November, there was the oath of the clergy, which basically said that they denounced all their systems and the way that they inherited land. Interestingly, this oath, and anyone of the clergy who took this oath, was denounced by the Pope. 1791, on the 13th of April, the Pope condemns the civil constitution, which of course he would. Popes are corrupt, they're wicked men, but they're not stupid. They're very intelligent people, and he understood exactly what was going on here. He understood that he was going to cop it if things got out of control, and eventually, of course, he did. The 19th of June, the nobility was abolished. On the 20th of June, the monarchy tried to flee again. They fled to Varennes, which was very nearly in Prussia, which is Germany today. This mistrust burst in demands for the king to be dethroned, and it did ultimate in that. In 1792, on the 20th of April, war was declared on Austria. Now this is the grievous and malignant ulcer that we read of in Apocalypse chapter 16, the first of the vials. The beginning of the Revolutionary Wars, which eventually resulted in the Napoleonic Wars. On the 25th of April, the guillotine was first used. On the 10th of August, the king was essentially dethroned. He was suspended from his duties. This was the overthrow of the monarchy. The witnesses were now in heaven. The political heaven, of course. They weren't in the literal heaven, but Apocalypse chapter 11 verse 12 says, "And they ascended up to heaven in a cloud." All these people of Paris descended on the king, removed the king, and became the government. In 1793, on the 21st of January, the king was executed. He was beheaded by the guillotine. He was followed by his wife, Marie Antoinette, on the 16th of October. We've all heard of that mountain man, as he's called, Robespierre. He created the Committee of Public Safety. Couldn't be a more ironic name. He committed thousands to the guillotine. It was introduced, says one writer, only in 1792 and designed as a humane means of execution by rational men who failed to foresee the effect of the rivers of blood it released when used on large numbers of victims. This was the beginning of the Reign of Terror. And that Reign of Terror really was a reign of terror. It was hideous. Houses had inscriptions on them: unity, liberty, equality, fraternity, or death. As one person living in Paris at the time said, it had become dangerous to be considered less revolutionary than your neighbour. Political crimes were now so widely defined that nobody felt safe. People were sometimes executed as much for what they symbolised as for what they had done. Some were executed for being linked to nobility. Some were executed for a slip of the tongue. They may have said something in a quarrel. Off went their head. One woman was sent to trial for having a similar name to the real suspect. The judge said, since she's here, we might just as well take her. This was the Reign of Terror. Nobody was safe. One historian said that the Reign of Terror claimed over 1 million lives. Thus was avenged the 75,000 slain in 1572 at the massacre of St. Bartholomew's. This was the end of the world as we knew it then. No longer was tyranny permitted in France, at least not that kind of tyranny. And the Napoleon, the concordat that he made with the Pope dictated that the church was never ever allowed to own land again. It was deprivation of some of the revenues of the church. Everything was upturned. I mean, we've seen pictures of like San Francisco and so on, those earthquakes in the early 90s. Nothing was left standing, and that was pretty much how the French Revolution left France. And as we said, you know, let's not feel too sympathetic towards the common people. They were worshippers of the beast and his image, and they suffered as much as the nobility and the clergy. You know, Robespierre, Marat, Danton, they all lost their heads in due course. We say it again, the wicked are God's soul. So what brought the revolution to the end? Well, firstly, the execution of Robespierre and the end of the Reign of Terror was the one. The politics then swung to the right, but France was never the same again. The revolution had done its work in France. The Third Estate had avenged the blood of those 75,000 Huguenots. Enter Napoleon. We're not going to speak at all on Napoleon. But David Chandler marks this instance as the end of the revolution. It was the end of the power of the people of Paris. They had tried to storm the Tuileries in France to once again get their way on something else in 1794. He says, as the mob surged forward from their headquarters at the church of St. Roch, the order to fire was given. Several salvos of grape shot tore into the crowd at point-blank range, killing at least 200 and wounded probably twice as many more. The crowd, stunned by this ruthless action, hesitated, turned and fled. By dusk on the 5th of October, order had become everywhere restored. The crisis was over. The power of the Paris mob, so long the unpredictable sanction behind revolutionary politics, had been broken once and for all. That was essentially the end of the French Revolution. Of course, it wasn't the end. That was just the beginning of Napoleon's career, because he was the one who issued the command to open fire on the populace. I'll just quickly read Apocalypse chapter 16, verse 5. Because we're not warmongers, we're not thirsty for blood, but we are thirsty for truth. We are concerned with the welfare of God's truth. And all through, we have seen that truth has been stamped upon by the apostasy. I heard the angel of the waters saying, Thou art righteous, O Lord, which art, and wast, and shalt be, because thou hast judged us. For they have shed the blood of saints and prophets, and thou hast given them blood to drink, for they are worthy. And I heard another out of the altar say, Even so, O God Almighty, true and righteous are thy judgments. How could I speak upon the second great earthquake, which gave freedom to religion and freedom to secularism, without mentioning the fact that we, as brethren and sisters, are indebted to the French Revolution and its results. Brother Hall in Birmingham in 1898 said, just before Brother Roberts was due to embark on his voyage to Australia, where he was hoping to live, he said, at the beginning of the 19th century, the spirit of life from God entered into the witnesses, liberating the chained and imprisoned intellects which during more than 1,260 had been subject to Roman power through superstition and terror. The extreme reaction that set in was provided for by the Spirit of God. A man was required, like Dr. Thomas, with a special organisation and environment to detect, discover, rescue and defend the apostolic doctrine from the chaos of human thought and the lawless speculation of perverted intellects and spirits. Where do we stand today? Brother Robert says, to the charge of holding that the knowledge of the Scripture in the writings of Dr. Thomas has reached a finality, we plead guilty. If we were ignorant or unfamiliar with the Scriptures, or were like those who, when they attempt to write or speak, have to look at them through the telescope of dictionaries, concordances, and such like, we should not have ground sufficient to entertain this conviction. But our acquaintance with them, the Word, the Scriptures, in daily intercourse for 21 years, he said, enables us to be confident on the point. Our reading has not been confined to the Scriptures or to the writings of Dr. Thomas. We have read what others have to say. We have therefore all the materials to form a judgment, and our judgment is distinctly to the effect imputed that in the writings of Dr. Thomas the truth is developed as a finality, and that they are a depot of the Christian doctrine. In this sense, we are committed to Dr. Thomas. Dr. Thomas has been laid aside in the grave for a season, and so long as God permits life and health, we shall defend the mighty results of his labours against all ridicule and opposition from friend or foe. Were he in the land of the living, some who are in hostility would be in a different attitude towards him. When he reappears, they will be ashamed. Meanwhile, God, who used him in the doing of his work, lives to note the gap made by his death, and the results which are not unforeseen to him. In his sight, and with his help, we shall hold fast to the truth brought to light by his means, and, please God, will rejoice with him at the near impending realization of all the hopes of the saints in a day when the bitterness of present warfare will only add sweetness to the hour of triumph. And please let me read another one which is quite moving. The first Christadelphian gathering was held in 1872 in Birmingham in England, and you know that Brother Thomas was planning to move back to England, but he died before that plan could be realised. And they held a gathering in Birmingham, and on the last day of the gathering they went to the house that Dr. Thomas had bought and prepared to live there. And Brother Bosher says, our meeting is very interesting in itself, but we cannot meet here without having our thoughts called back in relation to this house, to the man who planned it and for whom it was built. We had expected in the good providence of God that we should have had some such gathering as this when our beloved brother should return to our midst. He had planned the house somewhat with that view. All the details, except the wing, are the work of his own brain, and whilst he was here he superintended it with his own eye. We can see what a taste he had in fixing upon such a spot without saying anything of the wisdom of purchasing the ground and building the house, for he doubted the wisdom of that himself before he died. Yet some of us can even now see the wisdom of the deity connected with it. It has proved a link in the chain of events in connection with the development of the truth which John Thomas was honoured to bring to light in his day and generation. Well, we have not had the privilege of meeting our dear brother here as we expected. One of the last things I said to our brother Roberts, one Saturday that we came over here in the spring of last year, and before we heard of the doctor's death, as we looked over the house calculating when it would be finished, was that it would not be long before the doctor would come over, and we should have a nice housewarming on his return. I went by train on the Monday to my business, and the next day I received the intimation that the doctor was no more. All our fond anticipations in relation to this house were destroyed. Crossing the Atlantic, we laid him in the grave, and I shall never forget, while I have consciousness in my brain, the moment I stood over the spot where we interred John Thomas. I felt, as I feel now, that he will rise from the dead the most honoured man of this generation in the estimation of the deity. And if we are to be accepted of the Lord in the day of his appearing, we must stand round our brother Thomas as his crown of rejoicing in that great day. The only thing I can say to that is Amen.